it was on Good Friday, of course, and so school was out. And I was home, and my parents were both at work, and so it was just my brother and I home. And I was sitting at the dining room table working on some homework. And when it started, and, we all have a lot, you often have little tremors in Alaska, and your first reaction is, oh, it's just another one. And then it got a little bit stronger, and my first thought was, well, maybe I should do what they say, get in a doorway, and so I jumped up and stood in the kitchen doorway, and about that time it really started to get strong, and it got strong enough that I couldn't at that point walk out of the house. I would have had to crawl, and so I stood there hanging on to the door jamb, and my mother had just bought a new set of dishes. Our kitchen was kind of L-shaped, and I was standing at one, and the door jamb was at one end of the L, and the cupboard doors flew open, and a cup came shooting out. My mother had left some dishes in the dish rack from breakfast, and the cup went right across the top of those plates, and ding, 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 and cracked them all, And I had one arm out, hanging on the door jamb, and one hanging out, trying to hold the other cabinets closed, because I was worried she was going to lose all of her dishes. and then I decided it was time to get out of the house, and so I kind of crawled out the back door, and I got as far as the steps and sat on the steps, holding on to the rail. There was a rail going down, and while it continued to shake, and it was snowing outside. It was March, and there was still some snow on the ground, and there was snowing lightly. And I just remember sitting there in kind of a puddle of water on the steps, with the snow coming down, and it went on for
4 or 5 minutes.
It was you have to check it, but it was 4 or 5 minutes long, so it was an extremely long quake. And then, of course, as soon as it's over, then all of a sudden you hear sirens and things like that taking off, and it makes a lot of noise while they're going on. And so when it ends, it's kind of this moment of silence, and then you hear sirens and so forth. And I lived on an Air Force base, so Dad, all the men were immediately called to work because the base is very vulnerable after something like that, and a lot of damage. And so the men were all called back to their jobs, and I can remember we all slept in one room together because we were concerned, about it, and just continued to have aftershocks for days after that. It's very interesting too, because after that you have this feeling that of vertigo almost, the sense that the ground is moving even when it wasn't, it was very strange, so it played with your inner ear. And of course there was a lot of damage. Our high school was a 2-story high school, and it just sheared the top level off, destroyed it. And so we were out of school for a couple of weeks, and then double shifted the rest of school over at one of the other high schools until they could, took them till the next fall to get our school back together. Enough that we could use it anyway.
I was working at the Hilton Hotel there in Anchorage, and I'd just gotten home from work and walked in the door in my parents' house and sat down. It was right at dusk, just as the sun was starting to set. It wasn't dark yet, 5:35 or 5:37, something like that.
Yeah.
And I was sitting in a chair in my parents' living room. My mom and dad were downstairs in the basement in that little office they had, doing some work. My brother and sister were gone. They were out and about. And it started to shake, and it didn't seem any different than any other earthquake we'd been to. And I'd never been afraid in an earthquake before. And the big difference was it just continued to go on. And it didn't stop. And as that didn't stop, I got I think this was maybe 15 seconds, before you started saying, whoa, this is different. And I got up, and it was just kind of gradually started to build. And I hollered at my parents, and they started to come upstairs out of the basement. And then it was going on long enough that it was starting to concern me, and I went to the front door and opened the front door with the idea, wasn't certain whether I should go outside or stay inside. then just as I got the front door open, it just absolutely hammered you. I mean, intensity went up 100 times. And if I hadn't had a death grip on the door jamb, I couldn't stand. It was that strong. And it went on for like 2 hours. It seemed.
It seemed like it was 10 minutes long, 20 minutes long.
It went on forever, and I knew that I was going to die.
I thought it was the end of the world.
Yes, and at first you think, well, gosh, is this just an earthquake? Is this just Anchorage? Is this Alaska? Is this the whole world that's coming apart? It was, the world was over, and my only concern was how I was going to die. The worst fear I had was going outside and having the ground open up and fall in a crevasse and have it closed. And I thought, if I'm going to die, I don't mind being crushed, but I don't want to be smothered. I don't know. That was my feeling. So I stayed in the door jamb, kind of thinking, if the house starts to collapse first, I'll go outside. If the ground opens, I'm staying inside. Yeah. But out in the front of Grandma and Grandpa's house there on 11th Avenue, you could see the waves in the ground, and they were 6 feet high. In other words, you could see imagine 6 foot waves just coming down the street, and the sidewalk and the street and everything going up. There was a neighbor across the street, and they had 2 weeping willow trees in the front yard, about 15 feet high, and the tops of the trees would hit the ground on either side. And you just thought, everything's going to collapse, everything's going to come apart.
When I was sitting on that step, I was facing a parking lot, and you could see the cars bouncing, but they were bouncing one tire, 2 tires, they were bouncing side to side, they were bouncing point to point, one tire here, one tire there, and they were clanging together in the parking lots, of course, because 2 would bump together, so it was doing a lot of damage to car fenders.
And, finally, it didn't stop abruptly like it started. The intensity was very high for a long, long time, and you just thought it's just never going to end. And then finally, it started to ebb a little bit, and you got hope, I'm still alive. Yeah, and then it slowed down. But once it started, it was you were just shaking. You couldn't even really tell for sure whether it was over because everything was moving. Well, then when it was over and you looked around and there was no visible damage in our neighborhood. Imagine the street going like that, and yet it wasn't damaged. And then I started to feel a little sheepish about, well, maybe I overreacted. I thought, how did I overreact about something like that? My parents then came upstairs. They couldn't climb the stairs until it was over, and they came up, and our first concern was Nancy and Jim. And they quickly came home, and they'd been just out in the neighborhood, and they just did the smart thing. They just sat down wherever they were. They just sat down because and fortunately there were no power lines or anything. We had no water, no
utilities
power.
Were shot.
Yeah. My dad at the time was building a home, a very elaborate home, down in Bootlegger's Cove, Inlet View, for Jerry Nerland, who, the Nerland's Home Furnishings. And it wasn't completely structurally done, and it stuck up so high. My dad's first concern is the Nerland's house is collapsed, and he had visions of this. And so my dad and I jumped in a truck, in his pickup, and we went up to 10th Avenue and started down 10th Avenue to go over to Nerland's house. And at first, as we drove, we didn't see too much damage, and we thought, well, maybe, then you start wondering about overreacting. And then we got to the corner of 9th and M. There was an 8-story apartment building that was under construction. It was structurally complete, but it was still being, so you were kind of used to looking at it. And all of a sudden I looked up and I said, oh my gosh, Dad, and it was just a pile of rubble where this building had been. And that really shook us up. And then Dad just didn't want to go any further. He didn't care. And so we turned around, and as we turned around, we could see a lot of damage in downtown Anchorage. So I can remember the Penny's building. Yeah. I could tell it was tipped. And then we realized, yeah, this was serious, and there was a lot of damage. And so we went home, and just about the time we got home, it was dark, and it started to snow lightly. And, my folks were well prepared. We got in the house, we put stuff around the doors to keep the heat. We didn't have water. We had something that really helped is my mother had a lot of plastic garbage bags, and so we put those over the toilet because you couldn't flush the toilet. Go to the bathroom and then tie them and put them outside because it was cold.
You could freeze it.
It would freeze. Okay. Sanitary. And we had water, they'd stored water, and we had food, and so we were, we kind of huddled. No one wanted to be separated, so we all huddled in the living room and together, and candles and so forth. And then literally every few minutes it was shaking again, and every time it would start to shake, it just terrified me.
Because you thought it's another big one.
Yeah, just absolutely terrified. Then about 6:30, I guess, just after it got dark, someone knocked on the door. And we opened the door, and at that time, down along 3rd Avenue, about C Street, there was military housing there because the military operated all of the long-distance telephone lines in Alaska, and the Signal Corps people were down there and in their homes. And there was a brother and sister Bennett that was in our ward, and they had 2 little children. And when we opened the door, here was brother and sister Bennett and their 2 little children. And when they saw my parents, she just collapsed in tears. She was so grateful. And what had happened is they were in one of the hardest hit areas, and everything was destroyed. And the fact is, the swing set in their backyard was 15 feet below the ground surface. And the smell of natural gas was so strong, they had to get out of there. And people were worried about fire. Their places were destroyed, and they just had their clothes on their back, the 2 of them, and they had nowhere to go. And so they started walking south on C Street. Their thought was to go to the 11th and E Chapel. And when they got down to 11th Avenue, they remembered my parents lived at B Street, so they turned left and walked down to our house. And when they knocked on the door, and we were all home, and there was a safe place for her and her 2 children, it was a really emotional thing for all of us. Mm-hmm. And we brought them in, and they just stayed with us. I don't remember how long, but we had food, and it was warm in the house, and we all cuddled together there on the floor. And this was on a Friday, and because we were right downtown, we had electricity by about 4 o'clock the next afternoon. Wow. And so as soon as we had electricity, we had heat again. So we were never in too bad a shape. Now, we didn't have water for quite a few days, and then for weeks afterwards, we had to boil it. They kept telling us, don't drink it,
And they were giving typhoid shots everywhere in town because the water system was in such bad condition.
And I just don't remember how long the Bennetts stayed with us. They were with the military, so I'm sure they wasn't too long. The military would have made arrangements for them, and taken good care of them.
Yeah, we lived on base, and because we were on base, we got water back pretty fast, too, and our utilities back, because the base had lots of GIs to work on it, And but there were places in town that were literally 3 months before they got their gas back on, because they had to go house to house and check out connections, and before people could use their gas.
I had a really, it was a very unsettling experience 2 days later. I was home in the house. It was 2 or 3 days later was all, and there was a family that lived on the other side of 11th Avenue, on the north side, and it was a husband and wife and 2 children, and their daughter, Sherry, was a friend of your mother's and mine, and the son was Jim's best friend. And I was sitting in the living room again, and all of a sudden the house immediately started to shake, just like the earthquake. And, that was terrifying. There was no build-up to it. And then it realized it was an explosion instead of an earthquake. And I ran out of the house, and I could look down the street, and the flames were already 25 feet in the air. And I ran down real quickly, and there was, it was David's house. This family. And the two kids had been blown out of the house and were in the yard and on fire. And there were two military guys, GIs, who stopped, and the three of us grabbed them and pulled them out of the yard until there was emergency people came fairly quickly, but we were right there. And but the father wasn't blown out. He was blown out where he was about half in the yard and half in the house, and died. And, we heard him. I mean, it was a very unnerving thing. And the two kids spent a lot of time in the hospital, particularly her, and both recovered. The mother wasn't home at the time, and what had happened was a gas line had broken in the alleyway, and the gas had gotten into the sewer service connection and come into the house, and it was down low. They didn't realize it because it's heavier than air, and he lit a match to start a Coleman stove to cook a meal, and that caused the house to explode. I remember there was one or two men killed at the airport because the tower collapsed, and there were air traffic controllers in the tower, and as I recall, there were a couple of men in there that died. There were some children and people killed in Turnagain. That was the hardest hit area residentially. There were houses that moved 500 yards, 400 or 500 yards.
Slid out into the inlet.
Yeah.
The one that really haunted me was there was I believe his father was a doctor, and Turnagain was the wealthiest area of town at that time. And he lived in Turnagain, and he was home babysitting his younger brothers and sisters when it struck. And he was a high schooler, and he got the other. There was like 5 kids. He got the other 3 out of the house, and he went back to grab the baby out of a crib. And as he came out, the ground opened up, and he and the baby fell in a crevasse, and it closed. They never recovered his body. They don't know where. Because the ground was moving, and that one haunted me. That really bothered me. The thought of him and his baby. I can remember they were telling everybody to stay off the phones because the phone lines would jam, and so it was a while, but it was within 24 hours. I couldn't stand it, so I just called real fast, and because phone lines stayed.
We always had phone service.
But we didn't have outside phone service. It was you couldn't call long distance. You could only call locally because of the damage. And so my best friend's father was a ham operator, and the ham operators took over, and he was up like 24/7 for days, relaying messages from families in Alaska or vice versa. And that's how we got word to my grandparents and stuff that we were okay, is he radioed some ham operator in Idaho who then called them and relayed the information,
One of the things that you found out quickly you didn't have enough of were batteries, because you used flashlights, and you absolutely had to listen to the radio, because that was your lifeline, was to listen to the radio.
They went on the emergency broadcast system, like you did, and so there wasn't regular channels on. There was just the emergency broadcast.
Right, but it was constantly, they were on there talking about the damage. They were relaying messages, so-and-so safe, people are looking for family. You just sat huddled in the living room listening to the radio for hours. That's what you did.
I remember, too, another thing that I remember strongly was the smell of natural gas in the air.
Yeah.
Because, so many broken lines. It was just, that icky smell of gas.
But the noise during the quake was so loud, you couldn't have carried on a conversation with somebody standing next to you without just screaming. The worst damage and the big death tolls were all coastal communities from tsunamis. And
Seward got hit.
Valdez. There was a small village called Shaniga, and there were like 35 people in the community, and like 28 of them were killed by the tsunami. I mean,
all that was left after the tsunami was the steps to the schoolhouse. Bizarre things happened. For instance, my brother slept in the basement bedroom, and we had kind of a pantry at the top of the basement stairs. And after the earthquake, we found things from the pantry down the stairs on the other side of the basement behind the washer and dryer. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, how they got there, we didn't know. But in the living room, we had a portable television on a stand, and I had a stack of 45 records sitting on top of it, and they stayed intact. But I assume it's because it was rolling.
One of the reasons is it's really a wave, just like an ocean wave. If your cabinets happen to be aligned, the doors happen to be aligned with the wave, the doors didn't come open, and you didn't lose your dishes. If they were perpendicular to the wave, it's just like a boat, then the doors were flying open. Some of the crazy things, Michelle, is, there was no water in any of our toilets because all of the water threw out of the toilet.
Alaska's building code really
made a huge difference.
Made a huge difference. And in fact, it was most of the buildings were wood structures, so they were flexible. Made a huge difference.
There were a handful of buildings and structures that fell down. That building, that office building that I told you about, the J.C. Penney's building downtown. Where Alaska Sales and Service is, they were just building that building, and it fell down and collapsed. The tower at the airport collapsed. But the vast majority of the damage was because of ground failure. Yeah, and that's where, there was a graben formed. And what happens, what a graben is a bluff. There's a crack developed, okay? And the bluff moves, and as it moves, the gravel at the surface rattles down into the thing, and so it looks like a slump. And it really isn't. What it is it's just this slope is failing and moving, okay? And this graben started down 4th Avenue, and it went right down the middle of 4th Avenue for a ways. And so the buildings on the south half were okay, and the ones on the north half were gone. I remember there was the Denali Theater was on the north side, and the marquee, the theater marquee, was sitting on the sidewalk. It hadn't fallen off, but it just sunk so that it was on the sidewalk. And that graben followed along 4th Avenue and wound its way down to 3rd Avenue and then down past L Street. In fact, there's still a building over in L Street, and the graben formed under the building, and half the building just sheared off and went into the graben, and they just framed up the back end and kept the half of the building that wasn't destroyed. It's still over there.
There was a grade school, and luckily it was Good Friday, because schools got hammered pretty hard. There was a lot of damage in schools, but it was Good Friday and school was out. And this elementary school was destroyed, and there was a house that was not too far from the elementary school, and when all was said and done, everything around this school was destroyed, and everything between this home and this school was destroyed, and it left this house sitting on a pinnacle, just like one of those cartoons.
Yeah.
The house was perfectly okay, but it was sitting on this little pinnacle of earth. It was just, but it was up there, and they had to condemn the house because there was no way to get in or out of it, and it was just a matter of time till this pinnacle failed. But at the time that you look around, and say, out the door, and there's nothing around it. Oh, I was going to tell you one thing though. They were just about to have senior prom. It was a couple weeks away, and my best friend's older sister was invited to go, and so she was in Penny's looking for a formal when the earthquake struck, and she was in a dressing room. She'd gone into the dressing room and taken off her coat and boots and all that stuff because it was winter, and put on the formal, and had stepped out of the dressing room to admire herself in a bigger mirror when the earthquake struck, and she looked back and watched that dressing room shear off into the streets, along with her purse, her coat, everything, and she's barefoot in this formal. And the lights were out, and she said she had to crawl out of the building, and she could see what looked like a dead person laying in the aisle. When she got there, it was a mannequin that had tipped over. But she crawled out of the building, and she says as she came out of the building, there was a Penny's employee taking names because she had merchandise on. And she thought that was rather bizarre. But anyway, she couldn't, it was hard to get home because a lot of roads were destroyed. And so she finally, someone gave her a ride and had to take her clear out by Fort Rich and stuff and double back to get her home to Elmendorf, where she lived. But anyway, she had to get the Pommel back to Penny's.
There were lots of rumors about a lot more people dying in Anchorage than there were. I remember the number 600. And a lot of people thought a lot of people had died in Penny's because of these mannequins, and the people inside getting out were crawling over the mannequins in the dark. The military was really good. They were almost immediately, they cordoned off the whole downtown area, and so there was a rope that ran down 9th Avenue, and Army personnel every few feet.
So there was no looting or things like that.
Yeah, there was no way to get into the core area where so much damage was done in these areas. It was in '64, and that was the spring I wanted to go find a job for an engineering company. Well, I never thought about it, but that earthquake was the full employment act of civil engineers. And I mean, people were just swamped, and I think that's why a 16-year-old punk-nosed kid got a job. And one of the contracts that we had was to reestablish elevations because the ground had moved so much. All of the survey benchmarks in the area were no longer valid. And we spent months and months establishing what these benchmarks were. And essentially how it wound up is that everything in Anchorage was 2.5 feet lower than it was before the quake.
Wow.
And it also moved 16 feet west, closer to Japan. Places in Montague Island came out of the water 35 feet. There's a place and as an engineer, I dealt with some of this for my entire career. There were issues that we would find, and there in Cordova, for example, the post office bought a piece of property, and we were investigating it, and we discovered that before the earthquake, there was a little cove that came off the bay and into the town, and people brought their boats in there and tied them up, okay? And during the earthquake, Cordova rose 16 feet, and so the water wouldn't come in there anymore. So they just filled it full of trash and then put gravel over the top, then sold it to the post office. But it was very confusing from a survey standpoint for a long time because the location of everything horizontally and vertically had changed.
Every once in a while, Dad would be dealing with an engineer who was a new guy, and he was dealing with something, and a sewer line or something wasn't where it was supposed to be, and Dad would say, well, when was it built? It was built pre-earthquake. Okay, well, you're going to have to look for it
2.5 feet lower.
lower.
My biggest concern after the first couple of days was your mother's birthday was April 7th, and I'd ask her out for her birthday, and I had a big deal planned. I had a gift for her, and I was going to take her out to a nice restaurant to eat, and all the restaurants were closed. Nothing was opened up, and I had this big plan to hold her hand for the first time, and I was terrified that we weren't going to get to do this for her birthday. And I knew where I wanted to take her, and I went over there every day trying to see if they were going to open up on time, and they did. And we were there the first day, and I took her to the movie. The movie theater opened up again, and that was good. Then I took her to dinner, and I actually did get her to hold my hand. That was really nice.